Hi, my name is Ahmed Rachid El-Khattabi, and I'm a PhD graduate of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Before I start today's webinar, I would like to thank Mary Eggert for inviting me to share my dissertation research as part of Global Water Work Connect webinar series. And the goal is to share research on water because we're all in this together. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted on YouTube and gwwconnect.com. Feel free to post any questions underneath wherever you're seeing this, and we'll answer them. So today's webinar is called Managing Demand for Scarce Water Resources, an evaluation of current approaches. And I'm going to start with a little bit about me and why I started to think about water scarcity, and then talk a little bit about why I think it's important, briefly overview my work, and then talk about it in more detail. So I was born and raised in Morocco and then moved to the United States to pursue higher level education. I started off in California before ending up eventually in North Carolina, where I completed my PhD in city and regional planning just last month. Like a lot of people that are currently in the water sector, my path to water was quite circuitous. I started to think seriously about water scarcity starting in 2014, when California was beginning to experience one of its worst droughts to date. Living in North Carolina at the time, I remember listening to news coverage about the drought and thinking to myself that I was kind of glad that I no longer lived there, mostly because it brought back childhood memories of filling up and stockpiling water bottles during one of Morocco's worst droughts in the 1990s. At roughly the same time that I was listening to this news coverage, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge had people dumping buckets of water of ice on themselves. A lot of these people were in my extended friend network living in drought-stricken California at the time. And to me, this was a does not compute moment. I couldn't understand why people could be wasting water and knowing at the same time that it was badly needed. When asked to do the challenge myself, I said absolutely not, and I actually called attention to the drought in California. In 2015, so not long afterwards, there was intense concern over a drought in Morocco, with a lot of experts warning that it was going to be just as bad as the drought that I had lived through as a kid. What I didn't know at the time was that 2015 happened to be a record drought year all over the world. All I knew was that articles about drought and water scarcity were popping up everywhere. And so I took it as a sign of sorts. It was at this point that I decided that I wanted to study water management professionally and started the PhD program in the planning department at UNC with the goal of identifying solutions from an interdisciplinary perspective. I think this is an important issue for everyone because cities all over the world are increasingly experiencing water scarcity. Cape Town is probably the most recent and prominent example of this. After a 3-year drought, dams were operating at about or under 25% capacity. And as you can see from the pictures, what this meant is that the city was getting to the point where it couldn't provide its 3 to 4 million residents with water. And the situation was so dire that people had to line up for hours just to get their daily ration. And this is happening in large cities all over the world, in both places that have historically been dry and others that have historically been water rich. Now, I want to be clear that when I say that cities are increasingly experiencing water scarcity, I don't mean that water is disappearing. Water is a renewable resource. What I mean is that there's an increasing imbalance between supply and demand. On the supply side, we're seeing changes in when and where rain is falling due to climate change. So there's a growing mismatch between the location of cities and reservoirs and water resources. This also means that droughts are becoming increasingly frequent, severe, and are lasting longer. On the demand side, cities are growing very fast. Today, a bit over 50% of the world's population lives in cities. And by 2050, this is expected to be about 70%. Along with increased population comes water-intensive industrial activities. And together, these demand-side pressures are projected to increase demand for water in urban areas by about 50 to 70%. And if you put these two parts of the equation together, what this means is that cities are increasingly coming up against water supply capacity constraints. The dominant solution to this has largely focused on shoring up supply. In other words, how to make sure that there's enough supply to meet demand. As an example, the figure on the left shows the city of Raleigh's water supply plan for securing water resources to keep up with demand over the next few decades. From my perspective, there are 3 main problems with this approach. The first problem is one that I already mentioned. It's incredibly hard to predict the impacts of climate change, specifically concerning when and where rainfall is occurring. So there's a problem over where we're creating our reservoirs and dams. The second problem is that most existing water resources are mostly allocated, if not over-allocated. What this means is that competition for water resources is growing. This also means that the cost of adding new water resources, so the effort, money, time, and political will of acquiring and securing new water resources, is also growing. And the third problem is that it's incredibly hard to predict demand. The figure on the left shows the city of Seattle's attempts over the years. The black line shows the actual demand, while the dashed colored lines show demand projections at different points in time. And as you can see from the figure, demand projections were far off the mark each time. So if you're just going off of demand projections, it means that cities are probably going to be wasting billions of dollars on unneeded infrastructure. So my dissertation focused on options that explore the opposite approach. Instead of increasing supply to meet demand, it's taking demand and managing it to meet supply. And this is known as demand-side management. Given current events, I'm pretty sure everyone in the world is familiar with the figure on the left and the concept of flattening the curve to avoid overburdening hospitals. So I'll use this as an analogy, knowing that it's not a perfect one. But just like the healthcare system's capacity is limited by the number of beds, ventilators, and masks, cities are similarly constrained by the amount of water supply available. And to make sure that cities can thrive moving forward, water managers need to use demand management to flatten the curve, or in the water sector, this is known as shaving the peak. So my dissertation consisted of 3 papers that explore 3 different areas for demand management, and I study all of these in the context of the United States. In the first paper, I examined the role of technology, because there's a lot of faith in the power of technology and our ability to innovate our way out of scarcity. For example, it's not uncommon to see headlines like the ones on the screen about how technology is the answer to water scarcity. But at the same time, there's serious concern that water sector isn't innovative enough. And as you can see from the figure, patenting activity in the water sector is a lot lower than other environmental sectors. There's also a lot of work that's documented that there's a lot less R&D money going into water relative to other environmental sectors. So this brings up the question, it raises the question, can we innovate our way out of scarcity? And just to give you an idea of what I mean by water technologies, I'm specifically considering 2 types of water technologies. Technologies that promote water conservation. So technologies like leak detection, no flush toilets, or drought resistant crops, or technologies that augment water supply. So things like desalination, water reuse, and groundwater pumping. In my second paper, I look at the effectiveness of prices for managing demand in the residential water specifically. And this is important because urban water supply networks are typically designed based on peak usage, which typically occurs during the summer, when up to 50% of all usage is for lawn and garden irrigation. And as you can tell from the figure on the right, this typically accounts for about 30 to 70% of overall annual usage, depending on the location. In my third and last paper, I explore the role of the state in coordinating local conservation efforts during drought periods. Because as cities grow thirstier, competition for water resources grows, especially among cities that share resources. And if you look at the cartoon on the slide, you can imagine that each person represents a city or competing water user, acting in their own self-interest. And as you can see, the result at the end is worse than if they had coordinated. And this often leads to conflict and lawsuits over water. So there's a real opportunity here for higher level governments to step in and coordinate conservation efforts and to make sure that users are cutting back. Now I'm going to talk about my papers in more detail, starting with my first paper on water technologies. And this paper is called "Is Drought in the Air? Effect of Droughts on Water-Related Patenting Activity." And the big question I try to address in this paper is if we can innovate our way out of water scarcity. Part of the faith in technological solutions that I mentioned earlier is that there is evidence that resource scarcities drive investments in innovation. We saw this for energy in the 1970s after the oil crisis. We saw this again in 2008 when oil prices peaked. We have also seen this for other natural resources such as copper, tin, and even food when they've been scarce. But the question is, do we see the same for water? And just like COVID has increased our awareness about disease transmission and the importance of good hygiene, we know that droughts lead to increased awareness around water. And if you look at the picture on the left, you can see very clearly what an empty reservoir looks like. This picture was taken in 2007 after a major drought affected the entire southeastern US, including North Carolina, the state where I'm located right now. And I can tell you from my work that even though it's been over 10 years since this drought, water utilities in the area are still worried about this happening again. Now, the same 2007 drought also rekindled tension between the states of Georgia and Tennessee, prompting Georgia to relaunch a lawsuit, essentially over a border that's 10 miles south of where it's supposed to be. In California, the most recent drought that I spoke of earlier led to a slew of legislations aimed at making conservation a way of life. Now, in this paper, I asked two research questions to understand the drivers of innovative activity in the water sector. First, I ask if does water scarcity lead to increased innovative activity? In other words, do innovators recognize water scarcity as a problem that needs to be solved? I actually find that no, it does not seem to be the case. For the second research question, I focus on a potential policy solution to increase water-related patenting activity. Specifically, I look at a solution known as the Water Technology Cluster Initiative that was spearheaded by the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, in 2011. And I find that this solution actually does in fact lead to an increase in the water-related patenting activity. Now, what are water technology clusters? It's a solution that's supposed to bridge the gap between research and ideas and the successful commercialization of new products. These clusters work by bringing together the various stakeholders involved in the innovation process, which include end users, universities, research centers, large firms, and various governmental bodies. It's supposed to leverage local strengths and industries that already have an established presence in a particular region. And as part of the initiative, the EPA would ease regulatory hurdles, provide support for meetings, opportunities for networking, help with planning, and help address funding challenges. And I examine innovation at a regional level for two reasons. The first is that managing water can be complicated because it's extremely place-based and context-specific. What I mean by this is that local factors play an important role in determining solutions in the water sector. The second reason is that I build off a body of work known as the Regional Innovation Systems literature, and this theory posits that regions are important for innovation. More specifically, this theory posits that innovation is largely driven by quote-unquote learning networks that are local. And I summarize the factors that go into this theory on the figure in the screen. And this figure should look very familiar to you because I showed you the exact same one in the last slide. And the reason the two figures are basically the same is because the Water Technology Cluster Initiative was created based on this theory. And what this theory essentially says is that spatial proximity is important for both the cooperative and the competitive behaviors that are necessary for innovation. As a result, innovators largely work on pressing problems that are quote unquote in the air in local specific areas. So in the context of this theory, my question can be reformulated as, is drought an quote unquote in the air problem? With respect to data that I use for this study, I measure innovation by looking at utility patents filed at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, or USPTO, between 1976 and 2018. And I identify or I pick out water-related patenting activities, water-related patents using patent classification codes. These codes describe the nature of innovation and are determined by patent clerks who are presumably subject matter experts. Now, there's typically a lag between the initial phases of R&D or the inspiration phase of the technology when the innovators come up with the idea and when the patent is actually filed. In the water sector, this lag is typically 6 to 8 years, though it could be a bit longer. So if patents are filed because of droughts, one would expect that these innovations would occur sometime 6 to 8 years after a drought. With respect to droughts, I measure their occurrence using data from the National Ocean and Atmospheric Office, so NOAA. And looking at the table, I focus specifically on droughts that are severe or worse, to specifically focus on droughts that represent a crisis moment around water, because they would have reduced reservoir levels to a point where water restrictions would have been imposed. And if you need a visual representation of this, it's on the screen. In terms of the water technology clusters, I geocode the locations for each of the clusters and map them onto my geographic unit of analysis that are represented by the pink or coral polygons. And these polygons are metropolitan statistical areas, which represent cohesive economics at a regional level. In terms of my research design, I use what's called a difference in difference model to examine both the effects of drought and the effects of water technology clusters. And what this model essentially does is compare patenting outcomes between locations that experience drought to those that don't, and compares locations that establish a technology cluster to those that do not. The model also contains a third component that examines what happens when a location with a technology cluster experiences a drought relative to the scenario in which it does not. Now, I should mention that one of the big assumptions that I am making is that innovators are filing for patents in the locations where they experience droughts. In other words, I'm assuming that they don't move locations after they experience a drought and file the patent somewhere else. Looking at the results, what I find is that innovative activity does not increase after droughts. And the way to interpret the figures on the screen is by looking at the circles. The circles represent the change in patent count relative to before the drought occurred. And the lines around the circles represents confidence intervals. And if the confidence interval, if the lines intersect the zero line, it means that the effect is statistically insignificant or not different from zero. And you can see there's a lot of variation with respect to water conservation, but that all of these effects are essentially not different from zero. So in other words, innovative activity is not increasing. It's not really different from zero. And the same, there's a lot less variation for the water supply technologies, but the same results hold, that they're not statistically significant from zero. With respect to the effect of water technology clusters, I find that there is an increase in patenting activity, both in the metro area in which the water technology cluster is located and in nearby metro areas. If you look at the figures on the screen, the 0 miles column represents the effect of technology clusters in the metro area in which they occurred, and these are large and positive. And the effect in neighboring metro areas are within certain radii, so the 50-mile radius or 100-mile radius are positive, though they're diminishing as you move out, as you move further and further away from the water technology cluster. Another interesting finding is that in the 200-mile radius, between 150 miles and 200 miles, the effect is actually negative. And the way I would interpret this result is that that innovators that would have innovated in those areas are actually filing their patents closer to where the technology cluster is located. And then with respect to the third model, the third component of the model where I examine the effect of droughts in places that have an established technology cluster, the impact is too soon to tell. It's indeterminate so far because of data restrictions. Remember how I mentioned earlier that it would require to look at the effect 6 to 8 years after a drought occurred. The data I have only goes out 7 years. So hopefully I will be able to update this study in a few years to be able to provide a more definitive answer. In my second paper, so moving on to the second paper, this paper is called Estimating Heterogeneous Price Responses for Residential Water. I collaborate with economists, engineers, and hydrologists to examine the use of price at managing demand in residential sector, focusing on the responses of different groups of households. And the big question in this paper is if prices work. The reason this is important is because several studies have shown that relatively low-income households are price sensitive, and households that are more likely to irrigate are essentially not price sensitive at all. And this is a problem for water utilities. It's a problem for demand management because it means that water utilities cannot use prices as a tool to either flatten the curve or shave the peak. One of the major limitations of the previous studies, however, is that they examine the effect of price under pretty small price variation. So one explanation for their findings could be that small price increases don't actually matter for households that maintain lawns. One of the major contributions of my study is looking at the effect of prices under very high price variation, which you can see on the figure on the slide. The large price variation you see on the slide is on the order of 40%, which is much larger than the 5 to 10% changes that have been examined in previous studies. So the 40% increases would be much harder for households that use a lot of water. It would be much harder for them not to notice these price changes. So to reformulate my question is, do higher prices curb the usage of households that likely irrigate? And I find that they do. Households that likely irrigate are more price sensitive than other households. And I use a model that examines the effect of prices, usage restrictions in the event of a drought, and the effect of environmental factors on outdoor water usage. With respect to my data, I collaborate with the local water utility in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, that serves both Chapel Hill and Carrboro, so the Orange Water and Sewer Administration Authority, OWASA. And I get two parts of the data from them. I get household level water usage at a monthly level, and that's my outcome of interest. And I also get information on water prices and when usage restrictions were put in place. So you can see on the graph that that there was a drought in 2002, 2003, in which usage restrictions were imposed. My study takes place over 6 years, so from 1999, October 1999, through October of 2005, and I focus specifically on residential households that don't move throughout the time period, and approximately it's around 4,000 households. I categorize households into 6 different groups based on their characteristics before price change. So these can be considered somewhat exogenous characteristics. Characteristics of these households that don't change over time. Specifically, I look at their wealth level, because this is going to be highly correlated with their ability to pay for water, but also their propensity to have lawns and irrigate. So I look at both high wealth and low wealth. And then I also look at their usage patterns in the pre-period, so before prices changed. And I categorize their usage into 3 main categories. So heavy water usage, moderate usage, and light usage. Where heavy water usage, their usage patterns correspond to those that irrigate. So very high water usage over the summer and peaks in the fall when households are likely seeding their lawns. And then for environmental factors, there's a bit of a problem because in the literature there's no real consensus over what variables to use. So studies have used temperature, precipitation, and several other measures, but there's no agreement on which to pick. And so I collaborate with hydrologists to derive an exogenous measure of water stress, and I do so at a census block group level using a hydrology model. So again, my model incorporates all these different factors and looks at their impact on outdoor water usage. The groups of interest, if you look at the table on the screen, it's the ones that are shaded in green. So the darkest green being the group that is most likely to irrigate, but also I'm also interested in the effect of heavy usage in general. So also the heavy usage, low wealth group. And so what I find is that prices actually do target heavy users, and this is the case regardless of their wealth. And I want you to focus on so to interpret the results. The shapes or the geosolids represent the different usage levels. So the heavy users are represented by squares, the moderate users are represented by triangles, and the light users are represented by circles. And I want you to keep your eyes on the square boxes, because this represents the group of interest, and this will continue into the next slide as well. But as you can see from this figure, the groups of interest are more price sensitive. So their price sensitivity estimates are further to the left. And these are different from the others. But this is good news for the use of prices. And then I also look at the effect of usage restrictions, and I think this is worth noting. So during the drought, there were 3 different severity levels. So the first set of restrictions were reduced outdoor water usage to 3 days a week. The second reduced it to 1 day a week, and the last reduced it to no days at all. The first two sets of restrictions didn't really have that big of an impact. You can see that the estimates are quite small. In the case of the 1 day a week restriction, you can see that this group of households, so the heavy water users of high wealth, actually increased their water usage during this restriction. And this was likely because they were anticipating the fact that there was a more severe restriction coming. But this is the result of that's important to take away is that heavy water users actually do reduce their usage the most during this time period. Now, one of the questions that my co-authors and I still have about this result is, to what extent were these restrictions actually enforced? And the answer to this question is, I don't know. As far as I know, there have been a few warning letters. The utility actually sent out a few warning letters, but no one, to my knowledge, no one got fined. Looking through historical documents, so looking at the city of Chapel Hill, the town hall meeting notes from the time period, I noticed that city officials actually thanked community members in general for reporting violations. So it actually got me thinking about how much of these reductions were actually due to the enforcement from the utility, and how much of it was due to community engagement. So in my last paper, I look at enforcement, but in the broader context of institutional, the broader institutional context of drought management. And I specifically look at the role of the state and the role of social opprobrium, or social shaming. In particular, I look at this in the context of California's most recent drought experience. So at the height of the drought in 2015, former Governor Brown issued California's first ever state mandate for water conservation. The mandate required that urban water utilities serving residential customers collectively cut their production by 25% over a 1-year period. And it assigned each water utility a percentage to conserve, without specifying how this percentage was, how to do so. And this percentage was determined based on how much the residential sector was used during the summer of 2014. All right, so to explain how the mandate worked, I want to direct your attention to the figure on the slide. The figure shows 3 tiers of actors. On the top is the State Water Resource Control Board, the state regulatory agency responsible for carrying out the state mandate. In the middle are water utilities subject to the mandate, and there are approximately 400 across the state of California. On the bottom are end users, and this mandate is mostly focused on the residential sector, so the context is residential, not industrial or commercial or agricultural. Each of these users can take actions, and these actions are represented by downward arrows. For example, the State Water Resource Control Board can told the water utilities how much to conserve, and can enforce this using its state regulatory powers. Water utilities can then engage in conservation by using what are called demand-side management strategies, and these are things like prices or usage restrictions that we already talked about, but these also include things like rebates or and several other types of policies. And the water utilities can enforce these policies by fining those who are in violation of them. The upward arrows represent expected outcomes that we're looking for. So end users can then conserve or not when it comes in response to the measures that water utilities take. And this will affect how much conservation, this will affect the amount of conservation at a water utility level, which in turn affects whether or not a utility is in compliance with the mandate or not. And as a part of the mandate, water utilities had to report all of this information, had to report information on enforcement and conservation outcomes to the control board. All right, so water utilities are basically sandwiched in the middle, stuck between the control board regulating them from the top and then end users on the bottom on whom their outcome depends. All right, but why use a mandate at all? The reason is because utilities face conflicting incentives to engage in conservation. On the one hand, they don't want to end up like South Africa, like Cape Town. They don't want to end up without water. So they have some incentive to flatten the curve or shave the peak. On the other hand, aggressively pursuing conservation means that they're going to lose out on revenue and potentially deal with a lot of angry people who don't want to cut back on their usage. So the use of a mandate is meant to provide more incentives for water utilities to engage in conservation. And it can do so in two ways. The first is increasing the political acceptance of local actions. And you can think of this as being very similar to when New York Governor Cuomo announced the stay-at-home mandate. He said, people can blame me and hate me if they have a problem with the mandate. So this is basically the same thing. Water utilities could turn around and tell their customers, it's the state that's telling us to do this. And because of increased political acceptance, some water utilities actually went out and hired water police to go out and look for violations. All right, so there are two problems with this approach. The first is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the effectiveness of demand-side management strategies, prices, etc. The second reason is that there may also be differences in how the same management strategy is implemented. So for example, two similar water utilities can both have usage restrictions in place, but implement them to different degrees. So it's really hard for the Water Control Board to look at these actions and interpret them correctly. In other words, water utilities may differ in how they enforce their policies. The excuse of the mandate may not be enough for some places. Some water utilities rely on more passive measures. So they, instead of hiring water police, they ask their end users, residential customers, to do the enforcement for them. And what this looks like is asking customers to issue complaints against other customers, so maybe their neighbors that are breaking the rules. Why would customers do this? Well, they probably will do this because of what are called intrinsic motivations. So this could be a sense of environmental responsibility or what are called nosy preferences. In other words, not only caring about about your own actions, but about the actions of others as well. So in this paper, I asked two questions. Does mandating objectives lead to higher conservation? And I find that no, I don't find a statistically discernible effect. And in the second research question, I asked, is public engagement important? And what I find is that surface areas with more complaints actually conserve more. So yes. In terms of data, I get my data from the State Water Resource Control Board. Specifically, I get the amount of water production, the amount of water produced for the residential sector at each point in time, so monthly in the year prior and the year during the mandate. I also get the information on the targets that each water utility received from this data set. And the most important thing is that the utilities, because of the timing of the announcements, water utilities could not manipulate the target that they were assigned. And then last but not least, I look at the extent to which policies were enforced across the different water utilities. I mentioned that some water utilities hired water police or water cops, and these are dedicated staff that walked or drove around looking for water usage violations. But the bulk of the policing was actually done by private citizens. And there are three main mechanisms through which this was done. The state had its own platform, and it was very easy to use. All it was a website that people could go on and identify what type of water violation was occurring and where. It didn't have to know its water utility or anything else. And if it wanted to, it could upload a picture. People could upload pictures. Some water utilities had their own platforms that allowed water customers to complain on other customers. And then there were also third-party apps, private entities that were creating applications to enable little brother to help with the enforcement. And so similar to the previous study, what I do is I classify water utilities by their end user characteristics, and specifically into 4 categories. I look at places that have high complaints and low complaints per capita. And I also look at whether or not how much of a backlog in complaints received, or in utilities actually seeking out the violations. So some water utilities had a large backlog, and I categorize these as low effort. And other utilities not only had no backlog, they were actually they were following up on many more cases than were being reported. So these are likely going to be the places that had water police. So they're going off and seeking out instances of water waste. So we have these 4 categories. places that had high effort and high complaints, low effort but high complaints, and the same for low complaints. All right, so in terms of my research question, in terms of my methods for this paper, I use what's called a regression discontinuity design, and it exploits the arbitrary cutoffs between the different tiers. And what I do is I look at two water utilities that have very similar characteristics, but are on either side of a cutoff. So one utility got a lower threshold, a lower conservation target. They were asked to conserve a lower amount than a utility that looked basically the same, but was asked to conserve more. And the reason this randomness occurred is because the thresholds that were chosen by the State Water Resource Control Board, those cutoffs were essentially arbitrary. So if the higher conservation targets were going to make a difference, if places that were asked to conserve more, if they conserved more, we should see something like the figure on the slide, where you see higher conservation for those who were asked to conserve more relative to those who were asked to conserve less. What I find is actually the opposite. What I find is, if anything, the utilities that were asked to conserve less conserved more. But this effect is actually statistically insignificant. So the way to interpret these results accurately is to say that utilities on either side of a cutoff basically save the same amount. But where I do find a difference is in the amount of complaints received. What I find is that utilities with more customer complaints conserved more, and this is regardless of how to the degree to which the utility was exerting effort. So this is to interpret these results, it's very similar to the previous slides. So the circles represent the effect, where the further right the circle is, that means the more conservation. So utilities, with respect to their assigned conservation targets, utilities that with customers that complain more about their neighbors ended up conserving more. And this is true for both utilities that had high and low effort. And the same is true for just overall conservation. So utilities actually saved on the order of somewhere between 2 to 4%, 2 to 3.5% more than utilities that had low complaints and low effort. The interesting finding, I mean, the differences between utilities that have high and low effort for both high amounts of complaints are statistically not different from each other. But the point estimates suggest that utilities with higher effort maybe conserve a bit more. All right, so to conclude, what policy implications to take away from this? Well, from the first paper, I would say that water technology clusters show promise. There is in fact evidence that innovators are not necessarily paying attention to water scarcity as a problem that needs to be solved, but that water technology clusters is probably is potentially a viable solution. And from the second paper, I would say the biggest takeaway is that price is an important tool, but the implementation is complex. Specifically thinking about the effect of prices on low-income households. So what I do find is that households that likely irrigate are much more price responsive, but I find, on the other hand, that households that are low income are not price responsive. And this finding implies that they're spending a larger portion of their income on water. And that will lead to, the implication there is affordability. And especially during these times when we're trying to ensure that customers have water to not only go about their daily needs, but especially now when we're hoping that people have water to wash their hands, affordability is a very important consideration. In the last paper, the takeaway is that drought shaming works. People exerting social pressure on their neighbors and on others to cut down on water usage is, from what I find, was what drove the savings during the California mandate. And we can learn from this during COVID-19 when thinking about getting people to adhere to social distancing or stay-at-home mandates. It comes down to basically our ability to comply with the rules and encourage others to do so as well. With that being said, I'm sure I look forward to any questions that the audience may have. Feel free to contact me directly, or like I mentioned earlier, this video will be posted on both YouTube and gwwconnect.com, and you can post questions underneath wherever you're seeing this.
Yes, and thank you so much, Ahmed. This is really illuminating, very, very helpful for those in our GWW Connect community. And I just want people to know where you will be next. So maybe you could just comment on that next step.
Sure. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, I just graduated from the University of North Carolina with my PhD in city regional planning. And the next step is that I will be moving to Washington, D.C. to work at the Environmental Protection Agency as an Orise Fellow in the Office of Water.
Oh, what a wonderful contribution you have made. I know Sally Gutierrez there at the EPA, who started the water cluster movement, will be thrilled to hear about your studies here, as well as the individuals who are heading up the water clusters. And you're right, water is extremely local, but it's also all about collaboration and customer engagement, as you shared in your studies results showed. So thrilled to have you share this webinar with our GWW Connect community, and to look forward to following your efforts as you go forward in your career. So again, just echoing Ahmed, if there are questions you have, list them underneath where we have the webinar posted, and we'll do our best to route them to him if we're seeing those show up within the GWW Connect channels. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.